Christopher Monckton is my guest, and he's in Edinburgh, Scotland as we speak, and I'm in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. Hi, Christopher.
Hello, it's very nice to be on your program, and let's cover a lot of ground today.
Hey, we're looking forward to it. Now, Edinburgh, of course, was in the news just a couple of days ago, as were so many other places over in that part of the world with regard to the election. Were you front and center during the election?
Well, I was supporting the United Kingdom Independence Party, which gained more votes than any other party. Indeed, it surged from a previous 3% of the national electorate now to 12.5%. One voter in 8 voted for UKIP, but under the curious mathematics of the first past post-electoral system, we only got one of the 650 parliamentary seats. The big gainers were the Scottish National Party, or the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland, to give them their full title. And they have swept the board in Scotland. They took 56 of the 59 Scottish seats in the Westminster Parliament.
They're a separatist party.
Had 6 seats.
Are they a separatist party?
They are indeed, yes.
But wasn't there just a vote on that not long ago? Again, I'm in North America, so I don't know that I'm real current on things.
There was indeed, as recently as October last year, there was a vote which decisively said that Scotland wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom.
And
but
now,
at the same time, the politics is very strange, because the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland is no longer chiefly about independence. It's more about achieving objectives which used to be called communist or fascist. In other words, totalitarian, centralist, bureaucratic, and the big public sector trades unions have suddenly switched their support from the Labour Party to the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland. And so this party now represents the left, and I would say the hard left, the extreme left. It is a very, very strong left-wing party. And so I and many others are thinking, will we feel safe staying in Scotland? Because significantly, in the one conservative constituency north of the border, which remained conservative, SNP thugs were going around at the polling stations intimidating the voters into not voting for the Conservatives and voting instead for the SNP. This kind of thuggery, which of course one saw in the pre-Hitler years, the early years of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, that thuggery is now quite commonplace. We see it a lot as canvassing for UKIP. You go onto the doorsteps, and if you get a violent and rude and hostile and swearing response, we now have a standard answer to that. We say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, we hadn't realised that you were part of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland.
Your background.
Then they always say to us, they say, well, how do you know that we're nationalists? And we say, because it's only the nationalists that behave as violently and as unpleasantly as you have done. And every time this is the case. It's it is the nasty party.
Oh, my. Now, Christopher, your background is one of conservative, and I understand that you were a friend, or certainly an associate of Margaret Thatcher and other notable conservatives. Kind of fill us in on that a little bit, just so we have a sense as to where you're going.
At the time when the Conservative Party lived up to its name and was recognisably conservative, and Margaret Thatcher was its leader and the Prime Minister, I spent 4 years working for her in 10 Downing Street as one of her 6 policy advisors. And this was a unique position. It's very rare to have that level of access to a Prime Minister, but I was lucky enough to have that. And she was wonderful to work with, because she was conservative in the sensible, not too ideological sense of the term. She was very pragmatic. She wanted to make life better, not just for the rich, not just for the big businesses, but also for the mom and pop companies, and also for the ordinary working guy. And this broad brush, broad spectrum approach to politics, but very much in the free market tradition, was something we've now lost in Britain, and the only party which now still reflects that to some degree is the United Kingdom Independence Party. It still believes in the free market, it still believes in being independent of the European and UN bureaucracies which are increasingly being set
But-
over us
but
with
they're-
real governing power.
But they're not in
And
charge.
The Conservative Party of David Cameron is a very different animal altogether. It has just won an overall majority, albeit a very narrow one, in the UK elections, improving its position from being in a small minority before.
So what will happen
But-
now, Christopher, with regard to that? Now that Cameron actually has a majority, will he go further to the right? I mean, it's a little unfair the last
No,
several
because
years
he's not
call
conservative.
him
He's
something.
not right-wing. He is a left-winger who has decided to pursue a career in conservative politics because the left reckon they can get further in England in conservative politics than they can in the Labour Party. And
What impact does this have on the world? On the world overall with regards to your recent election in Britain and Great Britain? What's next? What impact does it have on the United States, on the United Nations, on Canada?
Right.
Pick a country.
First
Tell me the
thing
story.
is that as far as the European Union is concerned, the victory for Cameron won't make any difference. He has promised us a referendum in 2017 on whether we stay in the tyranny by clerk, which has replaced our democracy and now makes 5 laws in 6 for us behind closed doors, with us having no say over it. We do elect a European Parliament, but the European Parliament can't even bring forward a bill. It has no power. It is toothless. It's a talking shop. It's like the Duma of Tsar Nicholas II. It's there as a fig leaf to cover the absence of democracy. Now, the significance of this election really is this, that Cameron is completely committed to the idea of establishing a UN world government using the climate as the pretext.
But that's a pretty strong statement. You say he's committed to that. Is that
He's
public
committed
knowledge?
absolutely to it. He and the 2 other major party leaders
Yeah.
got together shortly before the election and they said that they would all support the Paris Treaty, which is coming up, which will establish for the first time a global unelected tyranny by clerk. So this will be the European Union, but on a global scale for the first time.
How
The
does
climate is the
America
excuse-
fit into that?
I'm sorry?
How does the U.S. fit into that?
The US fits into that because Mr. Obama is also committed to this nonsensical notion and this very dangerous notion, and has openly said so. And he will use whatever devices he can within the US Constitution to make sure that America signs up to this. Now, he doesn't have a majority in the Senate, and the Senate has to vote for any new treaty by a 2/3 majority. So the way they're going to frame this, I think, is to try to pretend that the Paris Treaty is not really a new treaty at all. It's an amendment to a pre-existing treaty. I'm not quite sure which one they're going to choose, but they will therefore say that amendments to existing treaties don't have to be approved by the Senate. Actually, they do if they're sufficiently big of a change. But that's how Obama is going to try and get round the fact that he no longer has the support of the people, and certainly no longer has the support of the Senate, to push through this treaty. But that's how he is going to do it. He went to China in December of last year so as to do a shoddy deal with them and avoid the humiliation that he faced in Copenhagen 5 years ago when the UN last tried to impose a world government treaty. And if people are listening in on this and they're thinking, oh, all this talk of global government, this sounds just too extreme for words. So it is, but it's also exactly what they have in mind.
What is it? Excuse me,
If you don't believe this,
Christopher,
then turn to
what is a global
Articles
government?
36 and 38 of Annex 1 to the Copenhagen Treaty draft, where the word government, in the context of global government, is used for the first time in any international treaty draft that I have ever seen. And I used to negotiate these on behalf of Her Majesty's government, so I know what I'm talking about. They were trying to set up a world government. They failed because China said it wouldn't play. Now, this time, in December last year, Obama went to China. He said, please, 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 we're all communists together here. Don't blow this out of the water a second time. If we're going to get global communism, we're going to get it via this UN treaty. Don't stand in its way.
So, Christopher,
And China this time
Christopher,
has
let me
agreed
interrupt you.
not to
Whoa.
stand in
So
the way.
when you're talking global government, you went from global government, the verbiage then went to global communist government. Is that what you think? It's a global
All right.
communist government?
Well, let us take away words like communist or fascist, and let us use the more neutral term, which is totalitarian.
Okay.
This is a government which wishes to control every aspect of our lives, down to how long we can have a shower for, what kind of light bulb we can use, every minute, even the communists and fascists of old didn't dream of trying to interfere in every tiny last detail. That's what totalitarianism is. It's the absolute control over every aspect of every person's waking moment. That's what these people want.
And you think that that's actually happening?
As a technique to get it. And if you read the current draft of the Paris Treaty, it is already available, you will see what I mean. Mm-hmm. Now, at the moment, what they've done is to shape this treaty draft as a series of options, which frankly, after 23 years of negotiation, you'd think they would have narrowed down, but they've deliberately not done that, because what they're going to do is to set up the global government. They're no longer going to use the word government, because we teased them for that last time, and they were very embarrassed. I did a video on it, and it got 3 million hits in 2 weeks. And so they know that if they try and actually openly call it a global government, then people will realize that and will laugh at them and vote it down.
Christopher,
so
who have you spoken to
a global governing
about this?
Body, and they're going to leave the details of the implementation of this treaty to that global governing body. The nations of the world are going to defer to it. They're going to say, we'll create the governing body, and it can then work out the details of how this treaty is to be implemented. Now, this is a very, very dangerous method.
Let's talk about a solution here. Who have you talked to about this in government? Have you ever talked to anybody in the, I don't know, Buckingham Palace? Have you talked to somebody in high places? And what have you taken away from that? I mean, what's the next step? Is there a solution?
They all want this. The governing class worldwide has tired of democracy. They don't want democracy anymore. It's inconvenient. It gets in the way. If, for instance, you talk to, say, Prince Charles about the climate.
Have you?
He will say, oh, I've studied this. Yes, I have. Oh, I've studied this myself. It's all settled science. How can you possibly raise any questions about it? And I say to him, actually, you haven't really studied it, with respect, and you've certainly never published in the peer-reviewed literature as I have. And the fact is, this is convenient, isn't it, for the governing class? Now, of course, you won't get a yes from any of them. They won't admit that this is why they're all supporting this climate agenda. There are a small, and it is a very small proportion of them, who genuinely believe, because they're stupid enough, that our tiny impact on the climate is going to be enough to cause disaster, unless they are put in charge of the world so that they can shut our activities down. There are some that actually believe that, but that's the minority. The majority of the governing class to whom I've spoken, they regard this simply as a matter of a convenient way to get rid of democracy and establish on a global scale the EU that we've already got. And the UN in particular is
Do you really think this will happen?
The European Union, because it has managed to acquire supreme political governing power in Europe. It now makes 5 laws in 6 for the member states. Yeah. And our parliaments only make 1 law in 6.
But Christopher,
laws in 6 prevail over our own law.
Do you think this will happen?
The UN wants that, and it wants it on a global
Do you think this will happen, and when?
Read the draft treaty.
I can't stop you, can I?
Available on the UN website. You will see what it is they're trying to do, provided you can understand the gobbledygook in which they write it. They no longer refer to a government. They now call it a governing body. They no longer refer to a power of taxation. They call it an economic power.
Christopher, hold it. Jump over.
They call it instead a facility.
Christopher, hey, let me talk just for a second. Let's roll over to
talking here.
Yeah, you're doing good. I mean, all of us here in North America, most of my audience is in North America, so I'm sure they'll all find it very enlightening, particularly when there's references to Margaret Thatcher and the Queen. And you've talked to the Queen as well, I'm assuming, on different occasions. Is that correct?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Prince Charles, yes.
Prince Charles, yes, and other people, notable people. And you feel beyond a doubt that Obama is old-commie, that he is a communist and he's pushing towards this? I mean, that's...
Let me tell you the story. I gave a press conference at the Willard Hotel in Washington shortly after he was elected. And among the things I said was how surprised I was to find that America, of all countries, had elected a communist as its president. And I was taken on one side by John Gizzi, the editor of Human Events, who was at that time the doyen of the press corps, and he said, look, we don't really use the word communist with such freedom over here. It has McCarthyite overtones, you know. And I said, look, I come from Yorkshire. When we talk about a spade, we tend to call it a spade. we don't tend to call it an instrument used in pursuit of agricultural purposes. And I said, if a guy walks like a communist, talks like a communist, acts like a communist, does things like a communist, was brought up by communists, his mentors were communists, his uncles were communists, his rhetoric is communist, then I'm going to call him what he is. And 6 months later, I went back to Washington, and I got a copy of Human Events, and there was an editorial by John Gizzi saying how unfortunate it was that for the first time in its history the United States had elected a communist as its president. So I rang him up and I said, John, do come and have some dinner with me, but I must just give you a warning. In America we don't use the word communist with quite such free. He said, don't you start, they've all been on at me about it. He said, but the fact is, we have to admit now, he said, of course he's a communist, of course that's the strand of policy that he follows.
Tell me about Canada. Is there a communist in Canada?
Away from that context.
Is there a communist in Canada as well?
The word totalitarian, which encompasses socialism, communism, fascism, all the extremist groups who think that they know best how every detail of our lives should be run. You go back to early imperial China, for instance. There, the philosophers of politics meditated upon what is, to this day, the essential divide, the great gulf between the two factions in politics, the totalitarians. They called them the legalists. That's perhaps the most neutral word one can use for this really very poisonous and dangerous faction. The legalists who want to control everything, the control freaks. And that's on one side. And then on the other they had the Confucians. We would call them the libertarians, the live and let live brigade, the let's not have too big a government, let's not give it too much power brigade, let's make sure that we have democracy so that people can make sure the government doesn't get too big brigade. That's us. That's you and me, I would venture to suggest. So it's this big divide is between the totalitarians and the libertarians, between the legalists and the Confucians. And on that side, we are Confucians, we are libertarians. We don't want a totalitarian world government telling us what size and type and color of light bulb we can have. It's none of their business.
So there's a fight going on between us and them, and we need to win, and we have to get our voice out there, and more than just a voice, we have to have action, because that's what it takes. So all we can do is keep on fighting and trying.
Needs to be done.
Yeah.
The one specific thing that needs to be done
is what?
Is to make absolutely sure that there is what is called a secession clause in the Paris Treaty. Now, any nation can insist that this be written in, and the others would have to go along with it. And all it says is that on 6 months' notice, any party to this treaty can leave and have no further obligations hereunder. Full stop. That's all it needs to say. There is one in the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, but there isn't in the present draft of the Paris Treaty. And that's dangerous, because they want to lock you in so that you can't get out again.
Yeah.
And the
well, if it was me, I wouldn't go in the first place. I'd throw everything in the trash.
Is to put in a secession clause into the treaty draft.
Yeah.
Now that's something which I'm already talking to some of your senators about. I shall be in Washington next month for further talks, and I will be giving them an appropriate draft for them to insert into the treaty, and to make it absolutely plain to Mr. Obama that if he tries to use any device to pretend that that treaty has been passed, ratified, or accepted, or in any way binds the United States, without that secession clause, they will vote it down.
Yeah. Gun control. You have to have the United Nations involved in that to disarm the citizens everywhere, in particular in the U.S., I think. Is that an issue as well? Is that one that you've been talking about?
Well, now, in the United Kingdom, we already have one of the tightest gun control regulations in the world, and it has worked very badly. To give you an indication of what happened, there was one of these dreadful school massacres. It was at Dunblane in Scotland, just up the road from here, in fact, and I think 20 or 30 pupils were killed, and immediately the then, of course, socialist government used this as an excuse to bring in panic.
That's what they do.
Pointless gun control measures. The effect of this has been that everybody who now wants to own a gun, particularly a handgun, will do so illegally, because it's just so complicated to get a license to do it legally. They have driven a formerly perfectly legal and generally quite well-behaved and sensible activity underground. The effect of this was to increase crime involving handguns by 80% within 1 year of the passing of that legislation, and that figure has remained very high ever since. So the legislation, as so often it does, particularly in the economic sphere, achieved not merely an unintended consequence, but precisely the opposite consequence to that which had been, however piously, intended.
Gun control goes with the re-engineering or the social engineering of the takeaway of democracy, and I think it's an important thing for the left wing,
Well,
the bad guys.
you have a constitutional right to bear arms.
Well, actually, I'm in Canada right now, but I'm also in the States a lot.
I say you, I talk about
I get
America.
it. I know what you mean.
In
You know
Canada,
what?
it's, again, rather different. But
Christopher,
I was
you're
in Canada a couple of years ago to give a mathematics lecture.
Yeah.
And one of the things they said, would I like to go and do some shooting? And I've never shot such a large variety of everything from automatic, semi-automatic weapons, rifles, even old Second World War German Lugers I shot, because they had a shooting club. It was, of course, well regulated and sensible.
Sounds
But
like
I
you
was
were
allowed to
shooting
shoot
some of
all
mine.
kinds of things.
All right. You know what? We got to run, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime. You're a wealth of information. We could, of course, talk all day, and you're the hardest guy to interrupt I've ever been with, and I like it. That's okay, because we learned a lot. And, you know, it's interesting stuff, and I can only hope that we win and they lose, but there's so much work has to be done, and so many people don't get it. They really don't get it. And it's easy to beat up the right, isn't it? Because we're busy. We're all trying to support our kids and our wives and buy cat food for our cats. So they're out to get us, and hopefully they won't win. In any event, Christopher, thanks so much for your time. Good luck in Scotland, and I hope it works out. And it will if all of us, guys like you and me, keep talking about it and doing things. So all the best.
Many thanks.
Thanks. See ya.